The trauma bay smelled like copper and burned plastic. A four-star admiral lay strapped to a gurney, his chest cracked open from a sniper's bullet, and he was screaming, not from pain, but from rage. He had already ripped 2 IV lines from his arm, shattered a monitoring unit against the wall, and put his elbow through the crash cart. 3 security officers had their weapons drawn. 2 attending physicians stood frozen in the doorway. Nobody moved. Nobody dared. Then a nurse nobody had ever really looked at walked straight into the middle of it. She was small, quiet. The kind of woman people talked over at staff meetings and forgot existed between shifts. She leaned close to the Admiral's ear and she whispered 4 words. Words that weren't in any hospital protocol. Words that weren't in any personnel file. The Admiral went completely still. His eyes found her face. Something cracked open behind them. Not pain this time. Recognition. Disbelief. Something close to grief.
"Sparrow 6, he rasped. "You're alive."
She didn't answer. She picked up the IV line he'd torn out, reinserted it with one practiced motion, and reached for the surgical tray like she'd done it 10,000 times before. Because she had. Before we go any further, if this is the kind of story that makes you lean forward and forget to blink, subscribe right now and hit that notification bell. Like this video and drop a comment telling me what city you're watching from. I want to see how far this story travels. Now let's go back to where it all started. Harlow County General Hospital sat on the eastern edge of Varnfield, a mid-sized industrial city in the interior of the country where the winters came early and the funding came late. It was not a glamorous posting. The building had been expanded 3 times over 40 years, and the additions didn't quite match. Different tile patterns in different corridors, ceiling heights that shifted without warning, hallways that dead-ended into storage rooms somebody had forgotten to label. The ER smelled permanently of antiseptic and old coffee, and the parking structure had a broken gate that maintenance had been promising to fix since the previous administration. Nora Voss had worked here for 2 years, 3 months, and, as of this Tuesday morning, 14 days. She knew the exact count because she had been counting down, not up, counting towards something she hadn't quite defined yet. A transfer, maybe. A different department. A different life. She kept the number in the back of her mind the way you keep a dull ache. Not ignoring it, not doing anything about it, just aware it was there. She was 32 years old. She had a badge that said N. Voss, RN in fading block letters. She had a locker with a stuck latch that she'd learned to open by hitting it twice at the bottom left corner. She had a reputation of sorts. Not a good one, not a catastrophic one. Just the particular kind of invisible that forms around a person when their coworkers have decided, without much discussion, that they don't quite belong. Voss? Dr. Elliot Marsh didn't look up from his tablet when she came through the staff entrance. He was the kind of man who had been good-looking 15 years ago and was still coasting on it. Broad shoulders, graying temples, the automatic authority of someone who had never once doubted that people would move out of his way. Bed 7 needs a dressing change. It was supposed to be done an hour ago. I was covering the intake desk. Martinez called out, "I don't need the logistics. I need the dressing changed." She didn't argue. Arguing with Marsh was a particular kind of pointless. He didn't register disagreement so much as he registered noise, and then went back to whatever he'd been doing. Nora had spent the first 3 months here thinking she could change that. She'd stopped thinking it sometime around month 5. She clocked in properly, changed her shoes, and went to bed 7. The patient was a 60-year-old retired machinist named Gerald, who had a post-surgical wound on his left calf that was healing badly because he kept picking at it and wouldn't admit it. He was grumpy in the specific way of men who have been told to rest and find rest humiliating. "You're late," he said. "I know. I'm sorry." She snapped on gloves. "Let me take a look." "The other one, the redhead." "She does it faster." "Nurse Pullman." "She's faster. That's true." Nora carefully removed the old dressing. The wound looked angrier than it had 2 days ago. She photographed it, made a mental note about the slight tracking along the inferior margin, and said nothing about it yet because she needed to check his chart notes first and see who was supposed to be managing his wound care protocol. Gerald watched her work with the expression of a man who has been disappointed by many things and expects to add this to the list. "You've been here long." "2 years." He looked at her hands. "You're careful." "Yes." "Marsh isn't." Nora kept her eyes on the wound. "I can't really comment on that." "He rushed the first surgery. I know he did. I could feel it. I was half conscious coming out of anesthetic, and I heard him telling someone he had a dinner reservation." Gerald's jaw tightened. "Nobody believes me." "I believe you," she said quietly. He looked at her more carefully then, the way people sometimes looked at Nora when she said something unexpectedly direct. She finished the new dressing, pressed the edges flat, stripped her gloves. "This wound has some tracking that concerns me," she told him. "I'm going to flag it in the chart. I'd like a wound care specialist to consult." "Marsh won't like that. That's not really the deciding factor." She flagged it in the chart. She knew what would happen. Marsh would see the note. He would make a comment at the next shift handoff about nurses staying in their lane, and the consult might or might not happen depending on who was on the following day. But she flagged it anyway. She always flagged it anyway. She had been flagging things for 2 years and watching about half of them disappear into the administrative fog, and she still flagged them because the alternative was not flagging them, and she couldn't do that. Down the corridor, someone was laughing too loudly. She recognized the voice. Dr. Priya Sundaram, one of the surgical residents, a genuinely talented physician who had somehow absorbed the culture of the department with the ease of water taking the shape of its container. When Sundaram arrived 18 months ago, she'd been uncertain, careful, the kind of resident who asked questions and triple-checked orders. Now she walked through the unit with the same casual authority as Marsh, cracking the same jokes, giving the same dismissive glances toward the nursing staff. Nora had watched it happen and found it deeply, specifically sad. Voss, a different voice, charge nurse Deborah Falk, who had been managing this floor for 11 years and who operated with the efficiency of a well-maintained machine and approximately the warmth of one. "The new attending wants to see the staff schedule for next week. Pull it and leave it on my desk." "I'm not the unit clerk." "Morales is at lunch. You're available." Nora pulled the schedule. The morning was the kind of morning that ground people down not through any single catastrophic event, but through the accumulation of small frictions. A medication order that hadn't been co-signed, requiring 3 separate phone calls to track down the prescribing physician. A patient in the observation ward who had been waiting 6 hours for a consult that kept getting bumped because the consulting service was short-staffed. A supply cart that was missing half its restocked items because the overnight aide had misfiled them. Nora worked through it methodically. She had a system, not written anywhere, just internalized, for triaging the administrative chaos of the shift alongside the clinical work. She knew which physicians responded to pages within 5 minutes and which ones you had to page 3 times. She knew which supply items were worth escalating and which ones she could improvise around. She knew the particular sound the cardiac monitor in Bay 3 made when the lead was just slightly loose versus when it was actually alarming. She had learned all of this over 2 years of being assigned to the jobs nobody else wanted to do, of staying late when others left on time, of being the person who answered the phone at the nurse's station because she happened to be standing near it. Nobody had asked her to learn any of it. Nobody had thanked her for it either. At 11:47, she was restocking the crash cart in the trauma bay. Technically an aide's job, but the aide was caught up with a difficult patient transfer when her pager went off. Then the overhead speaker crackled. Then every pager in the unit went off simultaneously, which was a sound that sat differently in the chest than a single page. It meant mass casualty. It meant something had happened outside these walls and the consequences were arriving. "Incoming trauma," Falk said from the doorway, already moving. "Shooting incident, VIP, federal escort, all available staff to Trauma Bay 1. Nora pushed the crash cart into position. She had already checked it. Everything was where it was supposed to be. No. They came through the ambulance bay with the kind of controlled urgency that spoke to professional training. Federal agents in suits alongside uniformed military personnel, 2 EMTs pushing a gurney at speed while calling out vitals in the clipped cadence of field medicine. The patient was a large man in his late 60s, broad-chested, silver-haired, wearing a dress uniform that had been cut away from his upper body. He had an entry wound below the right clavicle and an exit wound that the lead EMT described as messy, in a tone that meant considerably worse. 4 stars on the epaulette that hadn't been cut away yet. Marsh came in from the other direction, buttoning his coat, the tablet already in hand. Sundaram flanked him. 3 other residents positioned themselves at the periphery. Admiral Theodore Crane, one of the federal agents announced. Shooting incident at the Varnfield Convention Center. Scene is secure. We need this contained. No press, no non-essential staff, minimal documentation visible. This is a hospital, Marsh said, not a classified facility. Understood. We're not asking you to violate protocol. We're asking for discretion. Marsh was already looking at the wounds. His expression shifted from its habitual arrogance into something that looked almost like focus. He wasn't a bad trauma surgeon. Nora had given him that, privately, without ever saying it aloud. He was a good surgeon who had stopped being a good physician somewhere along the way, stopped seeing the person around the procedure. Let's move, Marsh said. They moved. Nora was already positioned at the equipment tray. She had checked the crash cart, she knew where everything was, and she had worked enough trauma responses to anticipate the first 5 minutes. She handed instruments before they were asked for, adjusted the lighting angle when she saw Marsh tilt his head in a way that meant the overhead angle was wrong, and kept her eyes on the monitors while everyone else's eyes were on the patient. The Admiral was semi-conscious. His blood pressure was dropping in a pattern that Nora recognized. Slow, steady, the kind of decline that happened when the body was compensating successfully for now, but building toward a failure point. She made a note to herself about the timeline. Then he opened his eyes. He was looking at the ceiling at first, unfocused. Then his gaze moved, tracking the faces above him, and something shifted in his expression. Recognition, then something that curdled into alarm. "No," he said. His voice was rough but clear. "No. No. Admiral, you need to remain calm. Get them out." He was trying to sit up. The restraints held, but he was stronger than he looked, his whole body pulling against them with a focused intensity that spoke to someone who had spent decades training himself to override pain. "Get them out of here. I know who sent you. Sir, I need you to stop moving." He pulled the IV, then the monitor leads. He got one hand partially free, and his elbow connected with the crash cart with enough force to send a tray of instruments skating across the floor. One of the agents moved toward him, and Marsh said sharply, "Do not physically restrain him. He'll tear the wound." 3 people talking simultaneously. Someone calling for sedation, the agent stepping back, hand hovering over a sidearm out of pure reflex. Sundaram frozen in place with a suture kit in her hands, uncertain whether to approach. Nora put down the instrument she was holding. She walked forward through the gap between Marsh and the nearest agent and positioned herself directly in the Admiral's sight line. She was close enough that he'd have to deliberately look past her to see anyone else. He focused on her. The struggling slowed slightly, not stopped, but slowed. She leaned in. "Sparrow 6 stands down," she said quietly. "You're clear." 2 seconds of absolute silence. The Admiral went still. Not the stillness of sedation or shock. The deliberate, trained stillness of a man who has just received an order from a source he trusts. His eyes found hers and stayed there, and the expression that moved across his face was the most complicated thing in the room. "Ghost," his voice cracked. He stopped, started again. "Sparrow 6, you're alive." "I need you to lie back," Nora said. "I need you to let us work." He lay back. Marsh stood behind her with the expression of a man watching something he didn't understand and found mildly offensive. He said nothing for a moment, then, "Voss, step back." She stepped back. She picked up the instrument she'd put down. She returned to her position at the tray. Nobody in the room asked what had just happened. The trauma continued. But the agents were looking at her differently now. And Sundaram was looking at her differently. And Marsh, when he thought no one was watching, looked at her with something that was not quite suspicion and not quite curiosity, and was, underneath both of those things, the beginning of something that looked a great deal like unease. That's it. The surgery took 3 hours and 40 minutes. Nora worked the whole case, which was unusual. Trauma cases typically cycled through staff as the length extended, but nobody replaced her, possibly because the room had found its rhythm and nobody wanted to interrupt it. She handed, she monitored, she called out values before Marsh asked for them with an accuracy that twice made him pause. The Admiral stabilized. When the team finally broke scrub, the hallway outside was full of federal agents, 2 uniformed generals, and a hospital administrator who had clearly been woken from sleep and was not pleased about it. Nora went to the scrub sink, washed methodically from fingertip to elbow, and did not look up. Voss, Falk appeared beside her. Administration wants to see you. Now? As soon as you're done. Nora dried her hands. She looked at the clock. It was nearly 4 a.m. The administrative wing was quiet and lit by overhead fluorescents that buzzed faintly in a way the maintenance tickets had failed to resolve for 8 months. Harlow County's chief medical officer, Dr. Arthur Weil, was a compact, precise man in his 60s who wore bow ties every day and kept his office so organized it felt slightly sterile. Beside him was a woman Nora didn't recognize. Dark blazer, federal ID badge turned backward on its lanyard. The particular posture of someone who spent time around weapons. "Nurse Voss," Weil said. "Sit down." She sat. "I want to understand what happened in that trauma bay." I assisted with the trauma response. Admiral Crane was agitated, and I spoke with him to de-escalate. "The federal team is asking what you said to him." I spoke to him calmly, sometimes a familiar voice. "He called you Sparrow 6, the woman in the blazer said. "That's a DIA call sign designation. Tier 1 classification. It does not correspond to any nurse currently employed at this or any other civilian institution." Nora was quiet for a moment. Admiral Crane was under significant physiological and psychological stress. He may have been confused. "He wasn't confused," Falk said from the doorway, which was not where Nora had expected her to be. "I was in the room. He was completely coherent when he said it." Weil folded his hands on the desk. "Nurse Voss, I've pulled your personnel file and there are some inconsistencies that concern me. Your nursing license was issued 4 years ago. Prior to that, your records are minimal. An address in a small town in Montana, a GED transcript, a gap of approximately 12 years that contains almost no verifiable documentation." Nora said nothing. "That's unusual," Weil said, in a tone that made it clear unusual was doing a great deal of work in that sentence. "That's the kind of gap that raises questions. I'm not required to document my personal history beyond what's relevant to my nursing credentials. You're required to be honest with your employer." "I haven't been dishonest." "Then explain the gap." She looked at the wall behind Weil's head for a moment. She looked at the fluorescent light. She looked at her hands on the arms of the chair. "I can't," she said. Weil and the federal agent exchanged a look. Falk, in the doorway, was very still. "Then we have a problem," Weil said. They suspended her at 5:45 a.m., pending investigation. That was the language. Pending review of personnel records and clarification of identity verification. It sounded procedural. It sounded almost reasonable. Weil delivered it in the same level tone he used for everything, and he was careful not to say anything that could be construed as an accusation, which Nora noted and did not appreciate in the way it was probably intended. She was escorted to her locker. She was given time to retrieve her personal items. The spare change of shoes, the phone charger, the battered paperback she kept meaning to finish. The security officer who escorted her was young and visibly uncomfortable, and he kept his eyes straight ahead like he was afraid that looking at her would require him to have an opinion. She didn't say anything to him. She didn't say anything to the 2 nurses who saw her being walked out and stood in the corridor watching with the specific blank-faced attention of people who are storing this moment for later. She passed the door to the ICU on her way out. Through the narrow window, she could see the bed where Admiral Crane had been moved post-surgery. Stable, monitored, guarded by 2 agents who stood outside the glass with the alert stillness of people expecting trouble. She kept walking. Outside, the sky was the particular dark gray of very early morning, not yet dawn, the city still mostly quiet. The parking structure gate was still broken. She walked past it, through the employee lot, and sat in her car for approximately 4 minutes without starting the engine. Then she took out her phone. She did not call anyone. She looked at the screen and then put the phone face down on the passenger seat. The thing she'd been counting down to had arrived. It wasn't a transfer. It wasn't a different department. She wasn't sure yet what it was, but it was here. Across the lot, a black sedan idled near the structure entrance with its lights off. It had been there when she came out. It had not moved. She started her engine. She pulled out slowly, signaling before she turned. A habit so ingrained she did it even at 5 in the morning in an empty lot. She did not look directly at the sedan, but she tracked it in her peripheral vision, and she noted the plate, and she noted the angle of the tinted windshield, and she noted that the exhaust plume in the cold morning air was coming from an engine that had been running for some time. She drove 2 blocks. The sedan pulled out and followed at a distance that was careful but not careful enough. Nora Voss took a breath. She had been careful for 4 years. She had been quiet for 4 years. She had watched herself become invisible in a hospital full of people who were happy to let her be invisible, because invisible was safe. And safe meant another day, and another day meant another shift, and another shift meant she was still here, still doing the only thing she'd ever been any good at, keeping people alive against the odds. She had hoped that would be enough. It was clear now that it wasn't. She turned north on Meridian Avenue, away from her apartment, and she drove. Behind her, the sedan kept pace, and somewhere in the hospital she had just been removed from, a man with 4 stars on his uniform was lying in an ICU bed, with a bullet wound in his chest and knowledge in his head that someone very powerful needed him to take to the grave. He had recognized her, which meant they had recognized her too. And she had approximately 12 hours, maybe fewer, before the people who had spent 4 years thinking she was dead figured out exactly how wrong they'd been. She drove north for 20 minutes before she was certain. Not certain that she was being followed, she'd established that within the first 4 blocks. Certain that there were 2 of them. The black sedan was obvious, a clumsy tail, the kind of surveillance that wanted to be noticed, that was designed to make her nervous and reactive. The second vehicle was a gray pickup truck 2 lanes over and 3 car lengths back, running parallel, its driver maintaining the exact same speed through 3 consecutive traffic light changes in a way that no ordinary commuter ever does. The sedan was the hand waving in her face. The truck was the hand going through her pocket. She had been taught to identify that particular technique when she was 23 years old, in a classroom with no windows, by a man who chain-smoked and spoke in sentences so compressed they were almost purely information. She had not thought about that classroom in years. It was strange how the knowledge came back. Not like remembering exactly. More like finding a word you'd always known how to pronounce but had stopped saying. She took the Meridian on-ramp toward the industrial district and let both vehicles follow her. The industrial district of Varnfield was wide and mostly empty at this hour. Warehousing, light manufacturing, a couple of logistics companies running 24-hour operations but with their activity concentrated at loading bays, not on the access roads between them. She turned off the main road, then turned again, working through a grid of side streets until she'd created enough angles to test the pickup's response. It adjusted too cleanly. Trained driver. Following a protocol. She was not going home. Her apartment was on the west side, a second-floor unit in a building with 1 entrance and no rear exit. A choice she'd made deliberately when she moved in, telling herself it was about the rent, knowing it was about something else. The something else being that if she ever needed to disappear again, an apartment with 1 door was a trap, and she had wanted the reminder of that. She had wanted to choose it consciously every time she turned the key. She chose it consciously now, driving away from it. There was a storage unit 12 minutes from the industrial district. She'd rented it under a different name, a careful, boring name, a name attached to a careful, boring paper trail. And she paid the annual fee in cash, and inside it was a bag she had packed 4 years ago and repacked twice since, adjusting for what she thought she might need, removing things she'd decided were paranoid, adding them back 6 months later. 2 changes of clothes. A first aid kit built from medical supply store purchases spread over 3 separate trips, $1,400 in small bills. A prepaid phone still in its packaging. Documents. Not the documents she'd been living under, but another set. Clean, the product of skills she wished she didn't have. She had told herself every time she repacked the bag that she would probably never need it. She pulled into the storage facility, swiped the access card, drove to the 3rd row. The sedan had stopped following at the industrial district. It hadn't tried the turns. The pickup had peeled off when she got on the access road. They would regroup. They would get the facility's address eventually, or they already had it. But she had minutes, and minutes were enough. She was at the unit for 4 minutes and 30 seconds. She came out with the bag over her shoulder. She sat in the car again, engine running this time, and she made herself stop and think. The Admiral was alive. He was in the ICU at Harlow County General, under guard, stable as of 2 hours ago. He had recognized her, which meant he knew what she'd been doing before she disappeared, which meant he was connected to that world in a way that made him a target then and made him a target now. The shooting at the convention center was not random. Someone had sent a sniper. Someone had also apparently sent surveillance to the hospital because the black sedan had been parked in the employee lot. And employee lots don't show up in public GPS data, which meant they had inside information about which staff had been present for the Admiral's intake, which meant the breach was already inside the hospital. She thought about the federal agent in Vile's office, the badge turned backward, the posture, the question about the DIA call sign asked in a tone that was too precise to be instinctive, too practiced, like someone who had been briefed on what to ask.
She thought about Gerald's wound tracking that she'd flagged in the chart, and how half her flags disappeared, and why a woman who knew better than to trust institutional systems had stayed in one anyway for 2 years, 3 months, and 14 days. She thought about the Admiral's face, the way he'd said her call sign, not in confusion, not as the delusion of a half-conscious patient, but with the specific recognition of a man who had been told something was destroyed and was now seeing it standing in front of him. She put the car in drive. She went back to the hospital.
The ICU was on the 4th floor, accessible from the main building through a corridor that connected to the East Tower via a sky bridge. At 6:20 in the morning, the sky bridge was quiet. An orderly pushing an empty cart, a woman in a visitor badge clutching a paper coffee cup, a custodial worker running a mop in long, unhurried strokes. Nora walked through it in her civilian clothes with the bag dropped in a public locker 1 floor down, and she moved at the pace of someone who belonged there, which was the only pace that ever worked. She had not been formally removed from the building. She had been suspended pending investigation, which was an HR classification, not a security one. Her badge still worked on the door scanner at the East Tower entrance. She noted that with the specific quiet concern of someone who understood that either the administrative left hand didn't know what the security right hand was doing, or they hadn't flagged her yet, or they had flagged her and the flag hadn't propagated to the door access system. Any of those 3 options was fine. What they had in common was that she was inside. She took the stairwell to 4, not the elevator. She came out into the ICU antechamber and stayed near the wall, assessing. 2 agents outside Crane's room. She'd expected those. A 3rd agent, plain clothes, seated in the family waiting area with a magazine he hadn't opened. That one she hadn't expected, and she factored it into her position. The charge nurse at the desk was someone she recognized. Hollis, mid-30s, methodical, the kind of nurse who followed protocol and took notes and kept his head down. He was focused on his screen and not looking up. She didn't approach the desk. She went to the medication cart in the alcove beside the nursing station, which required her badge and her PIN, and she had both because she hadn't been logged out of the system yet. She pulled up the Admiral's chart on the cart's screen under the pretense of accessing the medications bay. His last recorded vitals were 40 minutes ago. Blood pressure, heart rate, oxygen saturation, all consistent with a patient who was post-surgical and sedated and stable. But the waveform pattern on the most recent telemetry strip, printed and tucked into the chart by the overnight nurse, showed something that made her stop. She looked at it for a long moment. Then she looked at the timestamp. The strip was from 32 minutes ago. The irregularity in the waveform was subtle. The kind of thing you might miss if you were managing 4 other patients, if you'd just come on shift, if you were tired, if the attending had already reviewed the chart and signed off. But she had spent years reading these patterns, in conditions considerably worse than a quiet ICU at dawn, and what she was looking at was not a normal post-surgical arrhythmia. She put the strip back. She walked to Crane's room. One of the agents stepped forward. "This area is restricted. I'm part of the care team," she said. She showed her badge. She kept her voice flat and professional, the tone that communicated not threat, but the specific authority of someone who has a legitimate reason to be somewhere and finds the impediment mildly tedious. You need clearance from the senior agent. He's showing a rhythm abnormality on his last telemetry strip. I need to assess. She didn't wait for a response. She went in. Crane was sedated, as expected. The ventilator was breathing for him, slow and measured. The monitors above the bed showed current vitals, and she looked at them, and then she looked at the infusion pump at his bedside, and she read the labels on the lines running into his central line. One of them was wrong, not dramatically wrong, not an obvious error, not the wrong medication entirely, subtly wrong. The concentration was slightly off from what should have been ordered for a patient of his weight and his current blood pressure trend. It was the kind of error that happened in busy units, the kind of thing that would be written up as a near miss in a quality review, except that this particular error, in this particular direction, in a patient already stressed by surgery and blood loss, would suppress his cardiac output gradually over the next 2 to 3 hours until he coded. It might look like a surgical complication. It probably would look like one. She checked the order in the chart. The order was correct. Someone had set the pump wrong after the order was written, at some point between the last nursing check and now. She corrected the pump rate. She did it calmly, methodically, and she documented it in the chart with a brief notation that would flag for the charge nurse and the attending. And she stood there for a moment with her hand still on the pump and thought about the agent in the waiting room with the magazine he hadn't opened. She went back to the door. I need you to get your senior agent in here right now, she told the guard. Don't leave this door. He looked at her. He looked at her badge. He got on his radio. Son. The next 40 minutes were controlled chaos. The infusion issue was confirmed by the on-call pharmacist, who arrived with the tight-jawed expression of someone being woken from a call room nap and then rapidly becoming more awake as the implications set in. The ICU attending, Dr. Reyes, a compact woman in her 40s who had the slightly flattened affect of someone who had seen too many things go wrong, reviewed the pump, reviewed the chart, reviewed the order, and said nothing for a long moment that communicated a great deal. The federal agents had separated Nora into the consultation room adjacent to the nurses' station, where two of them stood with her in a space designed for conversations about diagnoses and prognoses, and were using it for something else entirely. The senior agent was a man named Doyle, and he had the quality of patience that came from spending years in situations where impatience would have gotten him killed. He was not friendly, he was not hostile, he was assessing. Walk me through what you saw, he said. She walked him through it. You identified a pump setting discrepancy. Yes. From the medication cart alcove. The telemetry strip was in the chart. The chart was accessible from the cart. And you came back to the hospital after being suspended. A patient I helped admit is in that room. Doyle looked at her for a while. The hospital administration has flagged your personnel file for identity verification review. That's a significant flag. I know. Is there anything you want to tell me? She thought about the black sedan. She thought about the pickup truck. She thought about the classroom with no windows and the man who chain-smoked and the skills she had spent 4 years pretending she didn't have. Not yet, she said. He held her gaze. That's an interesting answer. It's an honest one. Before he could respond, his radio crackled. He listened. His expression shifted, not dramatically, just a slight tightening around the eyes that communicated something had changed. He stepped out. She sat in the consultation room with the two remaining agents and looked at the window. Outside, Varnfield was fully waking up, the morning light coming gray and flat off the low cloud cover, the traffic on the street below beginning its daily accumulation. She had been awake for over 24 hours. She felt it in her shoulders and behind her eyes, but not in her hands, which were steady, which they had always been. 5 minutes later, Doyle came back. Admiral Crane is asking for you, he said. They brought her in under escort, both agents flanking her, which under the circumstances she found reasonable. Crane had been brought off sedation, not fully, but enough. His eyes were open and tracking, and the ventilator had been removed, replaced by an oxygen mask that misted slightly with each breath. He looked older in the daylight than he had in the trauma bay, which was the direction most people went once the emergency was over and the body started accounting for what it had been through. He looked at her for a moment without speaking. Closer, he said. His voice was rough from the tube. She moved to the bedside. The agents moved with her. He looked at their faces, and then he looked at her. "Are you clean?" She understood the question. "Yes." 4 years. "Yes." Varnfield. He said it like he was placing a fact somewhere in a mental file. Of all the places. It was quiet. "Was," he said. Not a question. "Was," she agreed. He closed his eyes for a moment. His respiratory rate was elevated but within range. His color was better than she'd expected. He was a man who had survived things before. She could read that in the way his body was already trying to stabilize, trying to compensate, fighting its way back through sheer biological stubbornness. "The shooting wasn't random," he said. "I know. There are people inside the investigation, Nora." He used her name for the first time, not her call sign, her name. "Not just one or two. The operation it's deeper than anything I can put on record without—" He stopped. His jaw tightened. "The pump. Someone said it wrong after the order was written, sometime in the last 2 hours. Who had access?" "Anyone with a staff badge. The monitoring logs will narrow it, but not immediately." She kept her voice level. "The agent in the waiting room with the magazine. I don't recognize him from the team that came in with you." Doyle, behind her, went very still. Crane opened his eyes. "You noticed him too?" "Yes." "Get his credentials verified," Crane said to Doyle. "Not a request." Doyle was already on the radio. The next thing happened quickly, the way things that have been building for a long time tend to finally happen. Not slowly and dramatically, but all at once, in a compressed few seconds that leave everyone slightly behind. There was a sound from the corridor. Not a shout, but a scuffle. The particular percussion of a physical altercation in a space not designed for one. Then Doyle's radio exploded with overlapping voices. Nora stepped back from the bed, away from the door, putting the medical equipment between herself and the entrance. The door opened. One of Doyle's agents came in backward, not under his own direction, and then the man who had been sitting in the waiting room with the magazine came in after him. He was holding a syringe, not a weapon, which was almost worse, because it meant he'd been planning something that was meant to look like medical procedure, and it also meant he'd been inside this hospital, inside this unit, for long enough to acquire it. He got 2 steps into the room. Nora was already moving. She had assessed the space when she entered, habit, old and automatic, and she had noted the IV pole beside the bed, the cardiac monitor on the adjustable arm, the crash cart, the visitor chair. She covered the distance to the IV pole in 1 step and used it the way it was not designed to be used, which was as a lever. The syringe hit the floor. The man went into the crash cart, and the crash cart went into the wall with a sound like a minor car accident. He was larger than her, and he recovered faster than she'd hoped. He got a hand around her forearm and she let him, because she needed him committed to that grip to do what came next. And what came next left him on the floor with a dislocated shoulder and a great deal of expressed surprise. Doyle's remaining agent had his weapon out. Doyle was in the doorway. Crane, in the bed, had managed to push himself up onto one elbow and was watching with the expression of a man whose assessment of a situation has just been confirmed. The man on the floor didn't try to get up. Nora stepped back. She was breathing harder than she wanted to be. Her hands were still steady. "Get the syringe to a lab," she said. "Don't let anyone on this floor. It didn't arrive with handle it." Doyle looked at her. Really looked. The way he hadn't yet. The way people looked when they'd been using one frame for understanding a person and needed to put it down and pick up a different one. "Who are you?" he said. She didn't answer that. She went to Crane's bedside and checked his leads, which had partially detached in the commotion, and she reattached them and checked his pressure and looked at his face and said, "You need to rest." "Not yet," he said. "Doyle." He pointed with 2 fingers from his good hand. "This woman is cleared at the highest level of my authorization. Whatever she asks for, she gets." "Sir, I need to understand." "There will be time for understanding later." His voice was fraying. She could hear it, the sedation wearing off against the effort of the last 10 minutes, the body asserting its limits. "Right now I need you to trust the person who just kept me alive for the 2nd time today." Doyle looked at Nora. She said nothing. He put his radio to his mouth and started making calls. The hospital by mid-morning was a different animal than the hospital at dawn. The shift change brought the day staff, and the day staff brought noise and movement, and the administrative machinery that ran on daylight hours, department heads making rounds, case managers running between floors, the dietary staff navigating the corridors with the breakfast service, families arriving at the visitor desk. Harlow County General resumed its ordinary texture, which made the federal agents moving through its hallways both more and less conspicuous, depending on where you were standing. Nora had been installed, without quite agreeing to it, in a small room off the ICU corridor that was usually used for families receiving bad news. It had 2 chairs, a box of tissues on a side table, and a window with a view of the hospital's west parking structure. She had declined to sleep, which Doyle had suggested twice with increasing emphasis, and then given up on. She had eaten a package of crackers from the vending machine and drunk 2 cups of terrible coffee, and she was working through what she knew, arranging and rearranging it. There were things she was sure of. The shooting at the convention center had been targeted and professional. Crane was the intended victim. The operation to silence him had a contingency, the pump setting, suggesting they had anticipated the shot might not be sufficient, which meant they knew what his security detail looked like, which meant they had inside information about federal protection protocols. There were things she wasn't sure of. The depth of the corruption Crane had referenced, the specific operation being protected, the identity of the man she'd put on the floor, whose credentials, Doyle had informed her with visible irritation, had been verified through 3 different federal databases and come back clean, which meant either the databases were wrong or someone had worked very hard to make them look right. She was thinking about that when the door opened and Falk came in. She had not expected Falk. Deborah Falk, Harlow County's charge nurse, who ran her floor with institutional efficiency and approximately zero sentimentality, stood in the doorway in her day shift scrubs and looked at Nora across the small room with an expression Nora had never seen on her before. "I wasn't sure you'd still be here," Falk said. "I wasn't sure either." Falk came in and closed the door and sat in the other chair with the deliberate posture of a person who has made a decision they're not completely comfortable with. She had something in her hand, a sealed envelope, letter-sized, with no markings on the outside. "I found this in the chart room," she said, "under the login station. It has your name on it." Nora looked at the envelope. "When did you find it?" "About an hour ago. I didn't open it." She paused. "I almost destroyed it." "Why didn't you?" Falk looked at her for a long moment. "Because I've been watching you for 2 years, Voss, and whatever it is you're hiding, you're not careless with people's lives. I've seen careless. You're not it." She put the envelope on the side table and stood. "That's all I have to say." She left. Nora looked at the envelope. She picked it up. Inside was a single folded page, no letterhead. The handwriting was cramped and pressured, the writing of someone working quickly or under stress. "They know you corrected the pump. They have someone on the nursing staff. Leave the hospital. Do not go to your car. The operation Crane was going to testify about is called Clearwater Hold. There are 7 soldiers still detained. If Crane dies before he names the location, they disappear. You are the only one who knows where the evidence is buried." She read it twice. Then she read the last line. "We sent someone to your storage unit. You have maybe 2 hours before they trace it back." She put the page in her pocket. She stood. She went to the window and looked at the west parking structure, where a gray pickup truck was parked on the 3rd level, in the same position it had been when she'd spotted it from the road in the industrial district. Not the same truck, same model, different plate. She stepped back from the window. The note said she was the only one who knew where the evidence was buried. That was not entirely accurate because she had not known until she read those words that there was evidence to find. Whatever she had been before she became Nora Voss, whatever Sparrow 6 had known and done and buried, she had not brought that knowledge into this life with her. Someone believed she had it, which meant someone had been watching her for longer than 2 hours, or 2 days, or 2 years, which meant the life she had built in Varnfield, the invisible life, the counted down days and the stuck locker latch, and the flags that disappeared and Gerald's deteriorating wound and the awful vending machine coffee. All of it had been conducted under observation she hadn't known about. The door opened. Marsh. He was still in his surgical coat, which meant he'd come from a case, and he had the particular expression of a man who has been assembling his outrage for several hours and has finally gotten around to delivering it. He looked at her standing by the window and said, "You need to leave this building." You've already suspended me. I mean permanently. Well's going to recommend termination pending the identity review. There's going to be a full audit of your patient interactions. He came further into the room, lowering his voice, which made it worse somehow than if he'd been openly angry. I don't know what you are, but what you did in that ICU, stopping that man, touching that patient's equipment without authorization. I corrected a pump setting that would have killed him. You are not authorized. It would have killed him, Dr. Marsh, in 2 to 3 hours. It would have looked like a surgical complication. She looked at him directly. Someone set that pump incorrectly on purpose. Do you want to be the attending who signed off on care while that happened? That landed. She could see it land. The specific fear of a man who has spent his career protecting his record from exactly this kind of liability. He recovered quickly, the way people who have practiced arrogance always recover, but the flash of it was there. This is beyond anything a nurse should be involved in, he said. Probably, she agreed. He left without saying anything else. The door didn't quite slam. He controlled it at the last moment, which told her something about him that she already knew. She went to the door and watched him walk down the corridor and turn right, toward the attending lounge. Then she went left, toward the ICU, because Doyle needed to know about the note, and because Crane needed to know she'd read it and was going to need answers he might not be strong enough yet to give, and because somewhere in this hospital there was a member of the nursing staff feeding information to the people who had tried to set that pump, and she was not leaving until she knew who it was. The hallway was busy now. Morning rounds, transport staff, the ordinary chaos of a hospital at full operation. She moved through it the way she always did, at the pace of someone who had somewhere to be, unremarkable, invisible. She was almost to the ICU door when she heard the alarm. Not a code alarm, a security alarm, the long flat tone that meant something physical, something in the building. And then, almost simultaneously, the sound she had not heard in 4 years, the sound that lived in a different part of the brain than ordinary sounds, the part that had been trained to respond before the conscious mind had finished registering what it was. Gunfire. 2 shots, then a burst from somewhere in the east wing. The hallway froze for exactly 2 seconds. That particular collective hesitation when everyone's brain is telling them what they're hearing while another part insists it can't be right. Then everything moved at once, alarms overlapping, staff diving for cover, a crash from somewhere ahead. Nora was already moving toward the sound. She didn't think about the bag in the locker downstairs. She didn't think about the note in her pocket or the gray pickup on the 3rd level of the parking structure. She thought about the ICU door 30 feet ahead and the man in the bed behind it and the 2 agents who had already been reduced to 1 after the incident this morning. She thought about 7 soldiers in detention somewhere, waiting for a man to name a location. She hit the ICU door at a run and came through it into a corridor that was full of smoke and noise and the particular specific horror of a hospital under attack. And behind her, cutting off the main corridor, an armed team in tactical gear was moving fast, and they were not moving like federal agents, and they were not moving like anyone who was here to help. The smoke was coming from the supply corridor. Not fire, a canister, the gray-white chemical kind that spread low and fast and was designed to create confusion rather than casualties. Nora understood that in the first second. In the second second, she understood that the ICU had 2 entry points, and the tactical team behind her was covering the main one, which meant anyone who knew the floor plan had already accounted for the secondary access through the equipment room on the north side. Someone knew the floor plan. She didn't slow down. She went through the ICU door and found the remaining agent, a young man named Casper, whose last name she'd never learned, standing in the center of the unit with his weapon drawn and his radio producing nothing useful, just overlapping transmissions from multiple positions in the building that had turned the channel into noise. "Where's Doyle?" she said. "West stairwell. He went to intercept." He went to the wrong location. They split the response on purpose. She was already moving to Crane's room. "How many staff in the unit right now?" 2 nurses, 1 tech, 1 resident. "Get them into the medication room. Lock it from inside. Tell them to stay down and stay quiet until they hear a specific all clear, not just an alarm silence." She pushed into Crane's room. He was awake. The alarms had done that, and the sound of shots and perhaps some deeper instinct that decades of operational experience had built into him. The ability to come from sleep to ready in the time it took most people to remember where they were. He had his hand on the bed rail. His pressure cuff was alarming because his heart rate had spiked, which was reasonable given that someone was shooting in his hospital. "How many?" he said immediately. "At least 4 in the main corridor, probably a second team for the exit routes." "Exits?" "Covered, or will be shortly." She checked the window. 4th floor, drop too significant without equipment, parking structure below, but the angle was wrong. "They want you moved or silenced. Moving is harder with your current status, so my guess is silenced." "My guess too." He looked at her. "You have about 30 seconds before they're through that door." "I know." She looked around the room with the rapid inventory she'd been doing all her life, the cataloging of what was present and what it could be used for, the spaces between objects, the geometry of the room. IV pole, crash cart, 2 oxygen tanks secured to the wall mount, supply cabinet, the adjustable overbed table, which was on wheels. "Can you tolerate being moved?" she said. "Define tolerate." "Uncomfortable and potentially damaging versus staying here." "Move me." She disconnected the ventilator. He was breathing independently, the vent precautionary post-surgery, and shifted to the portable oxygen tank, cracking the valve, confirming flow. She disconnected 3 of the 5 monitor leads, keeping the pulse ox because she could read it without the screen. She released the bed brakes. "Casper," she called. He appeared in the doorway. "Help me move this bed. Then I need you positioned at the door, not in front of it. To the side, below the frame." "I'm supposed to stay with the Admiral." "You are staying with the Admiral. You're staying with him in a different position." She looked at him directly. "I need you to trust me on the geometry." He looked at her. The same look Doyle had given her, the same recalibration, and then he took the foot of the bed. They moved Crane to the far corner, the blind corner relative to the door's line of sight, behind the crash cart. It took 45 seconds, and it wasn't gentle, and Crane made no sound at all, which was either impressive self-control or the painkillers doing their job. Casper positioned himself to the left of the door frame, below the natural eye level of anyone coming through in tactical posture. Nora took the oxygen tank off the wall. The door opened 30 seconds later, faster than she'd calculated, which meant the main corridor team had moved faster than she'd calculated, which meant her timing was off and she needed to adjust. 2 men. Tactical gear, suppressed weapons, moving in the practiced way of professionals. Clearing corners, controlling their entry. Not panicking. They cleared left, they cleared right, and on the right they found what looked like an empty bed, because the crash cart was blocking the angle to the corner, and in the time it took the lead man to process the empty bed, Casper hit the back of his knee and Nora swung the oxygen tank. She did not hit him in the head. She hit his weapon arm at the elbow, the specific joint that, struck correctly, causes the hand to open involuntarily and the weapon dropped. The second man was already turning and Casper had lost his angle because the first man was bigger than he looked, and recovery from a knee strike is faster in trained personnel. And for approximately 4 seconds, the room was purely physical. Weight and leverage and the sound of equipment hitting the floor, and then it was over, though not cleanly. Casper had a split lip and was breathing hard. One of the operators was on the floor and would not be getting up quickly. The other was secured to the bed frame with his own equipment restraints in a configuration he was not going to work free of in under 3 minutes. Crane watched from the corner. His pulse ox read 91, which was low but not critical. His face was expressionless in the way of someone concentrating very hard on not being a liability. "I need a radio," Nora said. Casper handed her the one from the operator on the floor. She found the channel the tactical team was using, different from the federal frequency, encrypted differently, a detail that confirmed these were not law enforcement, and she listened for 10 seconds to establish the pattern. 3-person teams, 2 teams plus command element. Command was directing from outside the building, which meant command had a visual on the exits and probably had eyes on the roof. The operation had a time limit. She caught a reference to a window of 9 minutes from the start of breach, which gave her approximately 5 minutes before they either achieved their objective or pulled out. 5 minutes was a long time in some contexts. It was not a long time in this one. "There's a second team," she told Casper. "They're coming through the equipment room." He looked at the far wall where the equipment room door was, and to his credit, he didn't ask how she knew, he just moved to the new position. She gave him the radio and the operator's secondary weapon and said, "Don't engage unless they're through the door. If they come through, you make noise and you make problems and you keep them in that doorway. Can you do that?" "I think so." "Think harder." "Yes," he said. "Yes." She went to Crane. "The evidence," she said quietly. "The note I received said, 'I know where it's buried.' I don't. I need you to tell me." He looked at her steadily. His breathing was slightly labored. Not critically, but the stress was costing him. Sparrow 6 was the handler for the forward intelligence cell in the operation. Before you were declared dead, you buried the primary evidence package. Location was known only to you and one other person. "I don't have that memory." "I know. That's why this is complicated." He paused. The other person who knew the location was Lieutenant Marcus Weld. He's one of the 7 being held. She absorbed that. The detention site location. Clearwater Hold operates from a facility outside the grid. No official address. The evidence package is within 30 kilometers of the detention site. That's the only geolocation I have. His jaw tightened. Weld knows the exact coordinates, but Weld can't tell anyone if nobody can reach him. So whoever wrote that note was wrong. I can't find the evidence without Weld, and Weld can't be found without the evidence. That's the circle they built. Yes. From the equipment room door, a sound. Not yet a breach, but the precursor to one, the specific vibration of a handle being tested. "There's a name," Crane said. "Someone inside the DIA who can break the circle without the evidence. Someone who has been building a parallel case for 2 years. I was going to name them in testimony." He reached up and took her wrist with his good hand. His grip was not weak. "The name is Ava Merritt. She's a civilian analyst. If Merritt receives my recorded testimony with the specific code phrase Meridian Anchor, she can corroborate everything with what she has. The case moves forward without the buried evidence. She'll be targeted. She already is. She just doesn't know it yet." His eyes held hers. "Find her before they do." The equipment room door came off its frame. Casper fired twice, deliberately into the door frame above head height, noise and distraction exactly as she'd instructed. Shouting from the other side. A pause in the breach. Tactical personnel encountering unexpected resistance recalibrate. And recalibration takes seconds. And seconds were what she had. She went to the secured operator on the floor. She had already noted his communication setup. An earpiece linked to a body unit, different from the radio, a direct command channel. She pulled the earpiece free and put it in her own ear. She heard a voice she didn't know. "Team 2, report. Target status?" A pause. No response from Team 2 because Team 2 was on the floor and secured to the bed frame. "Team 2!" The voice was controlled, unhurried, the voice of a person who operates from certainty. "We're past the window. Execute contingency." She pulled the earpiece out. "They're triggering contingency," she said to Casper, who was holding the doorway against 2 men in the equipment room with a weapon and what appeared to be sheer stubborn refusal to yield ground. "That means they're going to pull out and trigger whatever they have in place as a backup." "What backup?" She looked at Crane. He looked at the infusion lines. The ones she'd already corrected once. "Not the pump this time," she said. "No," he said. "Something harder to fix." She was already at the supply cabinet. What she needed was not in it, because what she needed was in the pharmacy on the 2nd floor, and the pharmacy on the 2nd floor was in a part of the building she could not reach in the time she had. She needed to think differently. She needed to think about what the contingency would look like. A delayed mechanism, something already in place, something that couldn't be unwound without the specific knowledge of what it was. She looked at his central line. She looked at the bag of crystalloid fluids running through it. She looked at the secondary port, which had a small piece of tape over it. Standard practice for an unused port, standard enough that she had not noted it earlier, and she noted it now with a coldness in her chest that she recognized as controlled fear. She put on a glove. She pulled the tape off the secondary port. The port had been accessed. The seal was slightly off, barely, the kind of thing you would see only if you were looking for it, only if you had a reason to look. She capped it, disconnected the line from the port, and held the end of the access tubing to the light. A residue. A small, almost invisible film of something that had been pushed through the line and had not fully cleared. I need a toxicology swab from the supply cabinet, she said to Casper, who could not help her because he was managing two men in a doorway, so she got it herself, one-handed, eyes still on the line, and she swabbed the interior of the port and capped the swab and put it in her coat pocket. Then she pulled the central line entirely. Crane made a sound, sharp, involuntary, because pulling a central line without preparation is unpleasant, even when it's necessary. She applied pressure to the site with two fingers and kept her eyes on his face, reading the color, reading the effort in his breathing, looking for the signs of whatever had been introduced beginning to manifest. His lips were pale. He was sweating slightly at the temples. "How long ago did you start feeling it?" she said. He looked at her. A long second. "About 10 minutes before the breach." "What does it feel like?" Chest pressure, some tingling in the hands. She looked at Casper, who was still in the doorway, who could not leave the doorway. She looked at the phone on the bedside table, which was connected to the hospital system. She picked it up. She dialed the pharmacy direct line. "This is Nora Voss. I'm in ICU, room 4. I need you to listen to me very carefully, and I need you to not hang up." The pharmacist was a man named Osei, who had worked at Harlow County for 7 years, and who had the quality, rare in any field, of remaining functional under conditions that short-circuited most people. She told him what she'd found. She described the residue as precisely as she could. He asked her 3 questions, specific clinical questions, and then he was quiet for 4 seconds. "That symptom profile with that residue description," he said, "is consistent with a cardiotoxic agent. The tingling is peripheral. The chest pressure is early myocardial involvement. What do I have in this room to work with? You don't have what you need in that room. Tell me what I have." He told her. She looked around the room at what it contained, at the crash cart she had used as cover, at the cabinet, at the residual supplies from the IV she'd pulled. She started building a stopgap from components. Not a treatment, not a reversal, but a bridge, the kind of intervention designed to keep a system functional while the real intervention was being assembled. It took 6 minutes. None of those 6 minutes were clean. Crane was conscious throughout, which was good, and also meant he was aware throughout, which meant he could feel everything she was doing that was uncomfortable, and some things that were worse than uncomfortable. And he did not complain once, which she noted and filed somewhere. Osei arrived with the actual medications 12 minutes later, running, which was not something hospital pharmacists typically did, but he ran. He had 2 residents behind him. He had called the attending. In the doorway to the equipment room, the tactical team had withdrawn. Casper was standing with the weapon at his side and a split lip and the expression of someone who has exceeded their own expectations and is not sure how to feel about it. In the main corridor, she could hear Doyle's voice, hoarse, commanding, and close. He had found his way back. She was standing at Crane's bedside with her fingers on his radial pulse, counting, watching the color in his face, when Doyle came through the door and stopped. He looked at the 2 secured operators. He looked at Casper. He looked at Osei and the residents and the medications and the disconnected central line and the controlled chaos of a room that had just barely held. He looked at Nora. She met his eyes. Her hands were not shaking. Her coat was torn at the left shoulder from the earlier altercation, and she had a bruise forming on her forearm that she would not notice until tomorrow. And her hair had come down from wherever she'd put it sometime in the previous 4 hours. "Is he stable?" Doyle said. "For now, he needs a medical toxicologist, and he needs imaging, and he needs to not be in this hospital anymore." She looked at him steadily. They had someone introduce a cardiotoxic agent through his central line. The port was accessed while he was in this unit, under your team's protection, by someone with unrestricted floor access. She paused. "Your protocols have a hole in them." His jaw was tight. "I know." "He can't stay here." "I know. And when you move him, you need to know that not everyone who helps you move him is on your side." The silence that followed was the kind that filled with the weight of what had almost happened. Crane's voice came from the bed, rough and low but coherent. "Doyle? Sir? This woman just saved my life for the 3rd time in 18 hours. A pause. He was conserving effort, spending it in precise amounts. "I want her on my protective detail for the transfer, formally. Whatever clearance you need to issue, issue it. Sir, she's a civilian. I'm aware of what she is. His eyes found Nora. I'm also aware of what she was. And right now I need the second thing more than I need the paperwork to catch up. Doyle looked at Nora again. She could see him running the calculation, so the liabilities, the protocols, the formal and informal constraints of his position weighed against the evidence of the last 18 hours. Fine, he said. Not enthusiastically, not comfortably, but with the practical acceptance of a man who had seen enough to understand when an argument was worth having and when it wasn't. The transfer needs to happen in the next hour, Nora said, before whoever is running this operation regroups. They'll come back, and next time they won't try to make it look medical. Agreed. I'll arrange transport. One more thing. She reached into her pocket and put the swabbed sample on the bedside table. Get this to your lab, and get me a secure phone. Not your network, not anything connected to your standard operations.
Why? Because I need to make a call before we leave, and the person I'm calling can't be on a compromised line. She met his eyes. Her name is Ava Merritt, and whoever is running this operation is going to figure out that Crane just told me that name, which means she has maybe 2 hours before she becomes the most important loose end in this entire operation. Doyle went still. She watched him process it. The name, the implications, the acceleration of a situation that had already been moving faster than anyone had managed to control. You know Merritt? He said. I know who she is. That's different. She picked up the secured operator's radio from the floor. But whoever sent these men knows exactly who she is and where she is, and we've been in this room for long enough that the tactical commander on the outside has already reported the failed breach, and Meridian Anchor is now a compromised code phrase, and we have... She checked the time. Less than 90 minutes before this entire situation changes shape. He was already reaching for his phone. She was already thinking 3 steps ahead, mapping the gaps, identifying the variables she couldn't control and the ones she could, the way she had been trained to do in rooms with no windows by people who had prepared her for exactly this kind of impossible, cascading, half-understood emergency. She had spent 4 years forgetting she could do this. She had approximately 90 minutes to remember everything. Across the city, in an unremarkable apartment building with a coffee shop on the ground floor and a broken elevator and a second-floor unit with a clear view of the street in both directions, Ava Merritt's phone began to ring. She looked at the number. She had never seen it before. But the prefix, a specific 3-digit sequence that shouldn't have existed on any civilian network, made her push her chair back from her desk and stand very still in the middle of her apartment, because that prefix was a ghost protocol that had been officially decommissioned 6 years ago. And the only people who knew it were either dead or in detention, or were someone she had spent 2 years trying to find proof that they were still alive. She picked up. The voice on the other end of the line was quiet for exactly 3 seconds after Nora identified herself by call sign. 3 seconds was a long time in a phone call. It meant processing, not hesitation. There was a difference, and Nora had learned it. Sparrow 6, Merritt said finally. Not a greeting, a confirmation. Meridian Anchor is blown, Nora said. They know Crane gave me the phrase, you have a window. I don't know how wide. How long has the line been active? 40 seconds. Then we have about 3 minutes before anyone running passive intercepts on Ghost Protocol traffic notices the activation signature. A pause. Background sound. The scrape of a chair. Movement. Where is Crane? Alive. Compromised location. We're moving him in the next hour. The cardiotoxin... Did you identify the compound? Nora stopped. How do you know about the cardiotoxin? Because I've been tracking Clearwater Hold's operational methods for 22 months, and cardiotoxic contamination of central line access ports is in their playbook. Page 47 of a document that officially doesn't exist. The sound of something being moved, a hard drive, something physical being prepared for transport. I've been building toward this moment for 2 years. The problem is that everything I have is inadmissible without a primary witness. Crane is that witness, which means the people running this operation know that as long as he's alive and talking, they're finished. Then we agree on the timeline. We agree on more than that. Merritt's voice dropped slightly. Sparrow 6, I need to tell you something, and I need you to hear it before we go any further. The operation that resulted in your declared death, the one 6 years ago, that was not an accident. It was not a field casualty.
It was a deliberate removal, authorized at the level of the operations command structure because you had seen the detention site. You were declared dead to prevent you from testifying to its existence. Nora was quiet. You were the only field personnel who made visual confirmation of Clearwater Hold's primary facility, Merritt continued. You and Weld and one other member of your cell. The other member of your cell is the reason the operation has survived this long. He's been inside the investigation since it started. He is the leak. Name. Not on this line, not with 40 seconds left on the window. A sharp sound. A bag zipper. Fast. Get Crane to a clean location. I'll send coordinates through the secondary ghost channel in 2 hours. Come alone. That's not a condition I can meet. Then come with Doyle. Nobody else. Nora, she used the name deliberately, the first time in the conversation, and it landed differently because of that. The person who's been inside this investigation, the leak, he was at the hospital this morning. He's been at the hospital since Crane was admitted. He knows your face now. He knows you spoke to Crane. And he has enough access to make sure neither of you arrives wherever you're going. The line went dead. Nora held the phone for a moment. Around her, the ICU room was still organized chaos. Osei's residents working on Crane, Doyle on his own phone in the corner, Casper at the door with his split lip and his weapon, and the particular alertness of someone who has been through something and is not ready to stop yet. She looked at Doyle. I need 5 minutes, she said. He looked at her and then looked at his watch and said, You have 3. She used 2 of them standing in the corridor with her back against the wall and her eyes on the middle distance, running through everything she knew about the people who had been in this hospital since Crane's admission. Federal agents, Doyle's team, the compromised one she'd already identified, hospital administration, medical staff, the man in the waiting room with the magazine who had come through the ICU door with the syringe, the agent whose credentials had come back clean through 3 databases, the agent whose credentials had come back clean. In her experience, credentials that came back clean through 3 federal databases in rapid succession meant one of 2 things. Either the person was genuinely who they claimed to be, or someone with access to all 3 databases had planted the verification in advance. The second option required significant infrastructure. The second option required someone who had been inside the investigation long enough and deep enough to know that credentials would be run when things went wrong. She thought about the note in her pocket. There are 7 soldiers still detained. She thought about Crane's words. The other person who knew the location was Lieutenant Marcus Weld. She thought about the gap in her own history, 12 years of it, the Montana address, the GED transcript, the deliberate nothing that she had constructed around herself when she rebuilt her life, and how that construction had been thorough enough that it had taken 2 years and a 4-star admiral and a sniper's bullet to crack it open. She had been careful. She had been invisible. And she had still been found, which meant her location had not been discovered through investigation. It had been known. Someone had known where she was for longer than she'd been a target. Someone had known and had made a decision not to use it until the calculus changed, until Crane became relevant again, until the operation needed to be shut down cleanly, until a woman nobody noticed could be useful either as a tool or as a loose end. She went back into the room. The leak knew I was here before the shooting, she told Doyle without preamble. This wasn't triggered by Crane's admission. Someone connected me to this hospital, this city, before the convention center. The shooting was the activation event, not the discovery. Doyle looked at her. His expression had undergone a significant evolution over the past several hours. The initial assessment, the recalibration, the grudging operational respect, and now something approaching the focused concern of a man who was running out of people he could be confident about. That means someone in my organization knew your location. Or someone who has access to the same information your organization has, which narrows it to about 40 people. Merritt says it narrows to 1. She kept her voice even. She has a name. She's not giving it on a compromised channel. We need to reach her in the next 2 hours before she moves to whatever fallback she's already setting up. I can't authorize. I know you can't authorize it. I'm telling you what needs to happen. You decide how to make it happen within whatever constraints you're working under. She paused. Doyle. Every hour we stay in this building,
The operations command structure is regrouping and resourcing. They sent 2 teams this morning. The next deployment will be better planned, and there will be more of them, and they will not try to make it look like a medical complication. He knew she was right. She could see him knowing it, and she could see the specific frustration of a man whose institutional training was fighting against his operational instincts.
I need to verify Merritt independently before I take Crane to coordinates she provides, he said. Fair, verify her. That takes time. Then start now. He stared at her for a long moment, and then he turned away and started making calls. And Nora went to the bedside where Osei was finishing his work, and she looked at Crane's face, which was exhausted and pale and still composed in the manner of someone who had been operating in impossible conditions for so long that the impossible had stopped having the same weight. She told you about the leak, Crane said. Not a question. Yes. She didn't give you the name. Not on the line. She looked at him. You know who it is. He was quiet for a moment. His fingers on the blanket made a small, involuntary movement, the closest she'd seen him come to visible agitation. I have a strong suspicion. I've had it for about 8 months. I couldn't act on it because acting on it inside the investigation would have flagged the investigation itself, and the 7 soldiers in detention are only alive as long as the people holding them believe the operation is secure. If the operation collapses, what happens to them? He met her eyes directly. That depends entirely on who gets to them first. They moved Crane at 11:43 in the morning. The transfer was not clean. Clean was not available. What was available was fast and defensible and layered with enough misdirection that anyone watching the hospital's exits would need to commit resources to multiple simultaneous possibilities, which divided their capability. Doyle ran it. Nora watched him run it and revised her assessment of him upward. He was good at this, better than his earlier rigidity had suggested, and he had the quality of a person who, once convinced a course of action was correct, committed to it without looking back. He had verified Merritt through 2 independent channels in 41 minutes, which was fast, and the verification had come back in a way that had visibly unsettled him, suggesting that what he'd found confirmed not just her existence, but the scope of what she'd built. Crane went out in a maintenance vehicle, in a bed that had been disguised as equipment in transit, with Osei riding alongside because Nora had argued for it and won. He was not stable in the way that made transfer comfortable, but he was stable in the way that made transfer survivable, which was the threshold they were working with. Nora went separately, in Doyle's vehicle, through the service entrance at the building's north side. She did not say goodbye to the hospital. She had nothing to say goodbye to, really, except perhaps to the locker with the stuck latch, which was a faintly ridiculous thing to feel, and she felt it anyway for about 4 seconds on the way out. They drove for 38 minutes to a location on the city's northeastern edge, a commercial building that had been retrofitted for operational use at some point in the past and maintained under a corporate front that Doyle's organization used for exactly these situations. Clean power, clean communications, enough medical equipment to function as an improvised ICU for 48 hours. Crane was transferred to the improvised setup with less trouble than she'd feared and more than she'd hoped. His pressure was holding. The toxicology swab had come back, rushed, with a preliminary identification consistent with what Osei had suspected. A synthetic cardiotoxin, low volume, timed release, designed to produce a cardiac event within a 6 to 10 hour window from introduction. They had caught it at the 2.5-hour mark. There was no version of that morning where Crane survived if Nora had not come back to the hospital. She thought about that once and then put it aside because thinking about it served nothing. Merritt arrived at 2:17 in the afternoon. She was younger than Nora had constructed from the voice, early 30s, dark-haired, with the particular controlled intensity of someone who had been operating under sustained pressure for so long that it had become their resting state. She came in with a hard drive and a laptop and a second bag that clinked in a way that suggested recording equipment, and she looked at Nora across the room with the expression of someone meeting a photograph they'd been studying for a long time. "You look different than your file," Merritt said. "My file is 4 years old. Your other file, the one I've been reconstructing for 22 months. She put the hard drive on the table. "We have a lot of ground to cover, and I need Crane conscious for the first part of it." She was not warm. She was not cold. She was focused in the absolute tunneled way of someone who had been working toward a single point for 2 years and could finally see it clearly, and the clarity had not relaxed her. It had made her more precise. She set up the recording equipment herself, refusing help with the specific efficiency of someone who needed to know every component had been handled by their own hands. She tested the audio twice. She checked the timestamp synchronization against 3 separate time sources. Then she sat across from Crane and said, "Admiral, I need you to tell me everything you know about Clearwater Hold, beginning with the authorization chain and the date of first operation." And Crane talked. He talked for 47 minutes, and the room was very quiet while he did. And Nora stood near the door with her arms crossed and listened to the shape of something she had been inside without knowing it. An operation that had begun as a sanctioned intelligence program and had been perverted over 3 years into something that served not national security, but the specific interests of the people running it. Service members who had witnessed too much or questioned too loudly had been detained not through any legitimate legal process, but through classified paperwork that existed only within the operation's own filing system. Documents that authorized detention without review, signed by a command authority that had itself gone beyond any legitimate oversight. 7 names, 7 soldiers. Crane named them one by one, slowly, with the specificity of someone who had been keeping those names in memory because memory was the only safe place. Merritt recorded every word. Her expression did not change. Her eyes were on her equipment and on Crane's face, and she asked clarifying questions at precise moments, not to interrupt but to nail down dates, to confirm the chain of command at specific junctures, to establish the evidentiary foundation that she needed. At the 30-minute mark, Crane said a name. Nora felt the room change. Not dramatically, just the subtle shift of a pressure system, the way a barometric change registers in the body before the mind has processed it. Deputy Director Roland Fitch, Crane said. He authorized the expansion of Clearwater Hold's detention parameters in the 2nd year of the operation. He signed the reclassification that removed the 7 soldiers from official personnel records. And he has been present in every federal investigation of Clearwater Hold for the past 14 months, in the specific capacity of overseeing the investigation's information security. Merritt looked up from her equipment for the first time. "That's on record." "That's on record," Crane confirmed. "Fitch has been the oversight officer," she said, not to Crane, but to the room, placing it somewhere outside herself so she could look at it. "He's been investigating himself." "For 14 months, yes." "He's the one who cleared the false credentials this morning," Nora said from the door. Both of them looked at her. The operator who came through the ICU door with the syringe, his credentials cleared 3 federal databases in rapid succession. That speed requires either pre-planted verification or real-time access to all 3 systems at an administrative level. She looked at Doyle, who had gone very still against the far wall. "Who has that level of access in your chain?" Doyle's face was a careful blank, but his jaw had tightened in a way that answered before he spoke. "Fitch has administrative access as part of his oversight role," he said. The words came out flat and measured, the tone of a man who is saying something out loud for the first time and finding the shape of it in his own mouth. "Has he been in contact with you today?" Nora said. He called it 0900, during the breach. He was asking for status updates. A pause. He knew the breach was happening at 0900. "Before your own teams had reported it." "Yes," Doyle said. The word was quiet. It held a great deal. Merritt was already at her laptop. "I have financial transfer records, 14 months of communication intercepts, and a parallel detention record that mirrors Crane's testimony on the 7 names. I've been building toward a prosecutorial package for 8 months, waiting for a primary witness." She looked at Crane. "With your testimony, this is complete, but Fitch will know we have it within hours. He has enough institutional access to begin dismantling evidence chains and compromising witnesses before any formal arrest process can move." "Then the timing is the problem," Nora said. "The timing has always been the problem. What do you need to make it unignorable before he can move?" Merritt looked at her. "If Crane's testimony went to the Senate Oversight Committee chair and the Inspector General simultaneously with my supporting documentation tonight, Fitch loses the ability to contain it. It becomes too large for any individual to suppress. But that requires a transmission path that isn't compromised, And every transmission path I have confidence in runs through infrastructure that Fitch's office has at least partial visibility on. Every path you know about, Nora said. Yes. Nora was quiet for a moment. She was thinking about a classroom with no windows. She was thinking about the skills she had been pretending for 4 years that she didn't have. She was thinking about the secondary ghost channel that Merritt had referenced on the phone, a communications infrastructure that had been officially decommissioned, that existed outside the current oversight architecture, that had been built before Clearwater Hold's command structure was in place, and therefore before they had known to compromise it. I need to know something, she said to Merritt. The Ghost Protocol channel, who decommissioned it? Merritt looked at her steadily. Officially, the program office, after the operation 6 years ago. And unofficially? Unofficially, the decommissioning order was signed by Roland Fitch. The room was very quiet. He decommissioned it because I used it, Nora said slowly. Before I was declared dead, I used it to route something. He shut down the channel to prevent anyone from using the same path to route it out again. Yes, Merritt's voice was careful, precise, which is why I've spent 22 months rebuilding a version of it that he doesn't know exists. And the evidence I buried, the package Crane said only I and Weld knew the location of. She looked at Crane. I routed it through the ghost channel before the operation went wrong. I sent it somewhere safe. Crane was watching her. You're remembering. I'm not remembering. I'm following the logic. She pressed her hands flat on the table. If I sent something before I was declared dead, and the channel was shut down to prevent retrieval, and the only people who knew the transmission destination were me and Weld. She stopped. The package is still in the ghost channel buffer, Merritt said. Undelivered, waiting. I found the transmission signature 8 months ago, but I couldn't access the destination without the originating credentials. She looked at Nora with an expression that was not quite wonder, but was adjacent to it. The originating credentials belonged to Sparrow 6. Everything in the room reconfigured. Nora understood it fully then. The full architecture of what had been built, and what had been done to prevent it from being dismantled. She had been declared dead not just to remove a witness, but to revoke the credentials that would release the package. She had been kept alive, at a distance, under surveillance, as a contingency, in case someone needed her credentials, in case the package ever became retrievable, in case the operation needed a clean ending that required proof. She had been kept as a key, and now she was being asked to use herself. If I access the ghost channel, she said, and the package transmits, Fitch will know the moment it moves. Yes. How long between transmission and receipt? At the committee and the IG simultaneously, with my supporting documentation attached? 45 minutes to full documentation review. After that, it's out of anyone's hands. Merritt's voice was steady. But the 45 minutes is a window where Fitch can still act. Against Crane. Against you. Against anyone attached to the transmission. That's the window we work with, Nora said. She sat down at the laptop. She looked at the ghost channel interface that Merritt had built. A reconstruction, imperfect, carrying the ghost of something that had existed years before. She recognized its architecture the way you recognized a building you'd been inside once, in a different season, in a different life. Her hands were on the keyboard. Doyle said, from the wall, once you do this, there's no version of the next 45 minutes that isn't dangerous. There hasn't been a version of today that wasn't dangerous, she said. Nora, Crane's voice from the bed, rough and quiet. If this works, if this transmits and the package delivers, Fitch will know it was you. He'll have nothing left to protect, which means he'll have nothing left to lose. I know. He'll come directly. I know that too. She looked at the screen. The credentials field waited. The transmission path Merritt had built stretched forward into a communication infrastructure that Roland Fitch had thought he'd buried 6 years ago, reaching toward 2 committees that would, once they received what was coming, find it very difficult to look the other way. 45 minutes. She typed in the credentials. The screen processed for 3 seconds, 3 long, suspended seconds where the only sound was Crane's oxygen and Merritt's held breath, and the distant ambient noise of the building around them. The package released. Merritt was already transmitting her documentation alongside it. her hands moving across her keyboard with the speed of someone who had been rehearsing this moment for 22 months and was not going to waste a second of it. Then Doyle's phone rang. He looked at the screen. Something moved across his face. Not panic, but the specific alertness of a man whose worst assessment of a situation has just been confirmed. "It's Fitch," he said. Nobody spoke. The phone rang a second time. "He knows," Nora said. "He already knows." Doyle looked at her. "The building's address is on record in your operational system," she said, "which he has access to." She stood. "How long ago did you log this location?" Doyle's silence lasted approximately 1 second too long. She turned to the window. The street below was ordinary. Afternoon traffic, a pedestrian or two. A delivery vehicle parked at the curb 2 buildings down that had been there when they arrived and was still there now, engine idling, which delivery vehicles did not typically do for 2.5 hours. She looked at it. It looked back. "We have maybe 8 minutes," she said. "Possibly less." Behind her, Crane had already pushed himself to sitting, slowly, effortfully, without being asked, his body complying through will more than capacity. Merritt was closing her laptop with one hand and reaching for the hard drive with the other, copying files to an encrypted remote location with the automatic priority of someone who has learned not to trust any single point of storage. Doyle was still holding his unanswered phone. "Answer it," Nora said. He looked at her. "Answer it. Buy us 6 minutes. Tell him the transmission failed. Tell him we're still in position. Tell him anything." She met his eyes. "You've been working under this man for 14 months. You know how he thinks. Use it." Doyle looked at the phone. He looked at Crane. He looked at Nora, who was standing in the middle of a room that was about to become very difficult to be in, with the same level expression she'd had when she walked into a trauma bay at 6 in the morning and whispered a call sign into a dying admiral's ear. He answered the call. "Sir," he said, and his voice was controlled, professionally neutral, giving nothing away. "Yes, sir. We're working on stabilizing the situation now. The transmission attempt was unsuccessful. There was a channel integrity failure." On the screen behind him, the ghost channel's delivery confirmation ticked from 0 to 1. The package had reached its destination. Doyle kept talking. His voice was steady. Whatever Roland Fitch was saying on the other end of the line, Doyle was absorbing it, processing it, feeding back exactly what was needed to buy the minutes they required. Merritt looked at the confirmation. Then she looked at Nora. "It's done," she said. "It started," Nora said. "Done is in 45 minutes. She went to the window and looked at the delivery vehicle and thought about the 8 minutes she'd calculated and revised the estimate down to 6, because the vehicle had just been joined by a second one coming from the north end of the street, and both of them had the same idling patience of vehicles containing people who were waiting for a signal. 6 minutes. She had remade herself once in a small town in Montana with $1,400 and a name she'd picked for how ordinary it sounded. She was not going to need to do it again. But first she needed to get through the next 6 minutes, and the 6 minutes after that, and the 45-minute window at the end of which Roland Fitch's ability to stop any of this would simply, finally, run out. She turned from the window. "Everyone move," she said. "Now." They moved through the building's back corridor with the particular economy of people who have stopped discussing and started doing. Merritt had the hard drive in her bag and her laptop under her arm, and she moved fast, no wasted motion, the practiced speed of someone who had mentally rehearsed evacuation more than once. Doyle was still on the phone with Fitch, talking in the measured cadence of a man managing a conversation while doing 4 other things simultaneously, and Nora watched him do it and understood that he had been preparing for this specific betrayal, in some part of himself, for longer than he'd admitted. Crane was the problem. He was ambulatory, barely, and at cost. And Osei had his arm and was doing the calculation that medical personnel always did in these situations, the running assessment of what the body could sustain against what the situation demanded. Crane was doing his own version of the same calculation and arriving at a different answer, which was that he would walk out of this building on his own feet and the body would catch up later. "The rear exit opens to a service alley," Nora said. "The vehicles are covering the front approaches. If they have the building address, they have the street grid, but the alley connects to a loading zone 2 buildings east, and the loading zone has exit access to a side street that doesn't run parallel to their approach vectors. "You've been mapping the building since we arrived," Doyle said. It wasn't a question. He had ended the call. Fitch had given him enough, apparently, or Doyle had run out of credible things to say. "Since before we arrived," she said. "I had 4 minutes in the vehicle." He looked at her for approximately 1 second and then said, "Lead." She led. The rear exit was a heavy fire door with a push bar, the kind that alarmed when opened. She disabled the alarm contact with a piece of tape from the supply room, a technique so basic it was almost embarrassing, but basic worked, and pushed through into the alley. Cold afternoon air, the smell of garbage and diesel, and the particular urban anonymity of a space nobody designed for anything except utility. The alley was clear, not permanently clear. She could hear the second vehicle's engine on the cross street, still idling, which meant they were maintaining positions and hadn't yet been told to move. Doyle's call had bought them something. Not much. "Move," she said. "Steady pace, don't run until we're past the first junction." They moved. Crane walked with Osei and said nothing and put one foot in front of the other with a focus that was almost meditative. The pure concentration of a man who had decided that pain was information but not instruction. Merritt was beside Nora. Their pace matched, and she said quietly, "The committee confirmation, I should have received an automated receipt by now." "You haven't?" "No." "How long overdue?" 3 minutes. 3 minutes was not catastrophic. 3 minutes was within normal variation for an encrypted transmission routing through multiple security layers. But 3 minutes was also the kind of gap that felt different when you were walking through an alley with people trying to kill you. They reached the loading zone. A freight truck was backed into it, engine off, driver absent. The exit to the side street was clear. Nora moved them through and out onto the street, where the afternoon continued its ordinary proceedings with the indifference that cities had for the lives being conducted inside them. A woman walking a dog, a food delivery cyclist weaving between parked cars, the distant sound of construction 2 blocks away. Doyle had his phone out. He was running the emergency extraction protocol, which Nora gathered involved a clean vehicle staged at a secondary location, and the vehicle was 4 minutes away. Her phone buzzed. Merritt's. They both looked at it. The automated receipt. 4 minutes late. But there, it was. Merritt exhaled a single controlled breath. "It's in." "Both simultaneously?" "Both simultaneously." She looked at the screen. The committee chair's secure inbox and the Inspector General's office. Time-stamped, encrypted, with my documentation package attached. She looked up. 41 minutes from now, 2 separate government bodies are going to open files that end Roland Fitch's career, his freedom, and Clearwater hold. 41 minutes, Crane said from behind them. He was leaning against the wall of the building with Osei's hand on his arm, and his color was not good, and he was smiling anyway. Not broadly, just enough. "I've been waiting 8 months for those words." The vehicle arrived in 3 minutes and 40 seconds. A clean sedan driven by an agent Doyle vouched for with the specificity of someone who had just revised their vetting criteria significantly upward. They put Crane in the back with Osei. Merritt took the front. Nora got in and pulled the door and the vehicle moved, and she watched the street behind them and saw no pursuit, and understood that Doyle's call had bought them the window they needed, and Fitch had not yet deployed his remaining resources. He was about to. But 41 minutes was now 39, and 39 was enough. Bushsik. Roland Fitch was arrested at 6:47 in the evening, in the parking structure beneath the federal building where he had worked for 11 years. He was not arrested quietly. That was the detail that the news coverage would return to repeatedly in the weeks that followed. Not the magnitude of the charges, not the 7 soldiers or the detention site or the operation that had run for 3 years beyond any legitimate authorization, but the specific, visible, public nature of it. He had been walking to his vehicle, the way he walked to his vehicle every evening, with the unhurried confidence of a man who had never seriously believed the structure he'd built could fall. He had his keys in his hand. He had his phone to his ear. He had 12 federal agents surrounding him before he processed what was happening, and by the time he did, it was already on video. A junior congressional aide had been in the structure, had seen the agents move, and had started filming with the instinct of someone who understood they were watching something that mattered. The footage circulated within the hour. By midnight, every major news organization in the country had the story. Not the footage alone, but the supporting documentation that Merritt had transmitted, released in coordination with both oversight bodies through a press liaison that Merritt had apparently also prepared in advance, because she had been building toward this for 22 months, and she had built it in full. Clearwater Hold, the 7 soldiers, the authorization chain. The detention site, which federal agents reached at 9:22 that evening, following coordinates that Crane had provided from memory, finding 7 people who had been held in conditions that the oversight bodies would later describe in language more restrained than the facts warranted. Lieutenant Marcus Weld was among them. He had been held for 19 months. He walked out of the facility on his own feet, which the medical team present noted was somewhat remarkable, and he asked immediately whether Crane was alive. When he was told that Crane was alive and that the operation had been blown and that the evidence package had transmitted, he sat down on the step outside the facility and put his face in his hands for a long moment, and nobody asked him to move or to speak, and eventually he looked up at the sky and said nothing, but his expression said everything. The hospital found out the way institutions find things out, not through a single announcement, but through the accumulation of information from multiple sources, each piece arriving at a different desk and being compared to the pieces already received until the picture assembled itself. Dr. Elliot Marsh saw the news at 10 in the evening on the television in the attending lounge. He was drinking coffee and reviewing a surgical case for the following morning, and he looked up at the screen and saw the coverage of Clearwater Hold and saw, in the supporting documentation that news organizations were now displaying in excerpts, the name Nora Voss appearing in the context of the word commander, and the phrase former Special Operations Medical Officer, and the words decorated in 8 years of combat service and officially declared dead. He sat with his coffee and looked at the television for a long time. He did not say anything. There was no one in the room to say anything to. He put his coffee cup down and looked at his hands, which were the hands of a surgeon, which were his best quality and the thing he had built his identity around. And he thought about the woman who had flagged Gerald's wound tracking and had been correct about it, and had been right about the pump, and had spoken something into a dying admiral's ear that nobody else could have spoken. And he thought about every dismissive thing he had said in her presence and everything he had allowed to happen in his unit, and the coffee went cold and he did not drink it. There were people who, confronted with evidence of how badly they had misjudged someone, respond with defensiveness and rationalization. Marsh was not, in this moment, one of those people. He was sitting in an empty room feeling the specific, unpleasant weight of a man who has looked at himself clearly and not liked what he saw. And it wasn't closure, and it wasn't redemption, and it was not going to undo anything. But it was real, and real was the minimum. Deborah Falk read the coverage at 6 in the morning in her kitchen before her shift, with her second cup of tea going warm. She read it twice. Then she put the phone face down on the table and finished her tea, and she thought about the envelope she'd found under the login station, and the decision she'd made not to destroy it, and how she had made that decision based on 2 years of watching a woman do her job with a care and a precision that Falk had noted and never mentioned, because she was a person who noted things and did not mention them, and she wondered if she had ever done Nora Voss a single act of kindness in 2 years, and the answer was no. And that sat with her in a specific way for the rest of the morning. Sundaram found out mid-shift from a colleague who had seen the coverage, and she stood in the supply corridor for 4 minutes processing it before she went back to her patients. She was 29 years old, and she had been in that hospital for 18 months, and she had learned its culture with the ease of water taking the shape of its container, which she had not thought about until now. She thought about it now. She had not yet decided what to do with the thought, but she was having it, which was a start. Nora did not watch the news coverage that night. She was in a different hospital, a military medical facility 30 miles from the city, where Crane had been transferred and properly stabilized, and was now, according to the attending who came out to update her at 11 in the evening, going to be fine. The word fine had a particular resonance after the kind of day they'd had, and the attending used it with the specific satisfaction of someone who had been given a challenging case and had brought it through. She was sitting in a corridor outside the ward, in one of those hard plastic chairs that hospitals provided for the people who could not leave and could not sleep. And she was very tired in a way that had moved past the ordinary experience of fatigue into something more fundamental. Her body had done what it needed to do for 20-plus hours straight and was now presenting a full accounting. Merritt found her at 11:30. She sat in the adjacent chair without asking, and for a moment they were both quiet, which was its own kind of communication. "The committee chair's office called," Merritt said. "They want testimony from both of us. Formal session 6 weeks from now." She paused. "It'll be public." "Public. Public." Nora looked at the corridor wall opposite. Institutional paint, off-white. The universal hospital shade that was designed to be inoffensive and succeeded by being forgettable. She had looked at a great deal of institutional paint over the past 4 years. 6 weeks is fine," she said. "There will be coverage, your real name, your history, the operation." Merritt's voice was careful, not soft. "You've been Nora Voss for 4 years. After the testimony, that's not the version people know." "I know." "Is that—" Merritt stopped herself. "I was going to ask if that was all right. That's not the right question." "No," Nora agreed. "It's not." The right question was harder, and didn't have a clean answer. She had built something in Varnfield. Not much. Not the life she might have chosen, but something real. Gerald's wound that she'd flagged. The flags that disappeared and the ones that didn't. The stuck locker latch. The terrible vending machine coffee. The counted days. She had been invisible, and she had worked anyway, because the working was the part that was hers. The part that no one had taken, and no one could reassign. And now the invisibility was over, and she was trying to decide how she felt about that. She decided she felt like a person who had been told to stay small for a long time and was now being asked to stand up straight, and the muscles for it were there, but they ached. "Weld asked about you," Merritt said. "I heard. He wants to talk when he's cleared medically." "I know." "He said to tell you—" Merritt paused. "He said to tell you that the package you transmitted 6 years ago was the right call. That you knew it was the right call even though you had no way of knowing it would ever reach anyone. He said that matters." Nora was quiet for a moment. The corridor was empty except for a night shift nurse at the far end, moving with the unhurried efficiency of someone managing a building while most of it slept. "It matters that he said it," she allowed. What she didn't say, because she wasn't sure she had the language for it yet, was that the part that mattered most was not the testimony or the coverage or the formal vindication that was coming. The part that mattered was something smaller and harder to name. The pump setting she had corrected at 5 in the morning in an ICU while being walked out of a job she was losing. She had corrected it because it was wrong and she was there and she could, and the institutional weight of everything pressing against her had not changed that calculation at all. That was the thing nobody trained you for, and nobody gave you a commendation for. The holding on when there was no audience and no recognition and no certainty that it would ever add up to anything. The flagging of the thing that kept disappearing. The returning to the building after being removed from it, not because anyone asked her to, but because a man was in a bed and his line was set wrong. It didn't make her special. It made her someone who had decided in a specific way what she was going to be, and had kept being it on the days when it cost something. The Senate testimony took place 7 weeks later, not 6, because the oversight bodies needed additional time to verify and sequence the documentation, and because Weld needed the medical clearance, and because these things moved in institutional time regardless of urgency. The chamber was full. That was unusual. Senate hearings ran at varying levels of attendance, and most of them were sparsely watched, even on significant matters. This one had a waiting list for the public gallery. The news coverage had done its work in the preceding weeks, and the public understanding of Clearwater Hold had developed in the way public understanding of large, complex institutional failures always developed. Imperfectly, with some distortion, some outrage in the wrong places, and insufficient outrage in others, but with a core of actual comprehension that would not be easily walked back. Fitch had been formally charged on 17 counts across 2 separate indictments. His co-conspirators, 4 of them, at different levels of the operations command structure, had been charged in the weeks following his arrest. The detention site had been officially closed, its existence entered into formal government record, and the 7 soldiers had been returned to their families with the specific inadequacy of institutional apology that was the best the institution knew how to offer. It was not enough. It was what was available. Weld testified first. He was thin, and he moved with the careful deliberateness of someone whose body was still recalibrating after 19 months of the wrong conditions, and he spoke in the flat, factual cadence of someone who had decided that precision was the only container adequate to what he'd experienced. He did not perform his suffering for the room. He described it accurately and let it stand. Crane testified second. He came in uniform, which was a choice that communicated several things at once, and he testified for 2 hours and 20 minutes. And when the committee chair asked him at the end if there was anything he wanted to add to the record, he said, "I want to state clearly that this operation was exposed, and this testimony was made possible by a woman who was removed from her employment, followed, targeted, and has spent 4 years living under an identity not her own because the institution she served failed to protect her. The record should reflect that." The committee chair said the record would reflect it. Nora testified third. She wore her own name for it. Not Nora Voss. Commander Nora Voss, which was the formal designation, which the committee chair used when he addressed her, and which felt strange in her mouth when she spoke it back to him, strange in the way that things feel when you have been absent from them for long enough. She testified for 90 minutes. She was asked about the events at Harlow County General, about the operation 6 years prior, about her experience during the years between. She answered each question with the same precision she'd applied to everything else, not performing composure, actually composed, in the way that came from having decided in advance what she would and wouldn't be undone by in a room full of cameras. Toward the end, one of the committee members, a woman from the Southwest, known for asking questions that the procedural framework tried to prevent, leaned forward and said, off the formality of the official record, "Commander Voss, you spent 2 years in a hospital where the people around you dismissed you. You were suspended under circumstances that any reasonable person would describe as unjust. You were targeted and surveilled and nearly killed. And yet you went back. You went back to that building after they walked you out. I want to ask why." The chamber was very quiet. Nora looked at the woman. She thought about the answer. Not the official answer, not the tactically appropriate answer, but the real one. "Because there was a patient in that building whose line was set wrong," she said. "And I knew it was wrong, and I was the one standing there." She paused. "That's it. That's the whole answer." The committee member held her gaze for a moment, then she nodded and sat back. The session ended 30 minutes later. She found Doyle in the corridor outside the chamber afterward, which she hadn't expected. He had testified in a closed session the previous week, and she hadn't seen him since the night in the military facility. He looked the same, contained, precise, the particular posture of a man who managed himself carefully. He'd been placed on administrative review pending the internal investigation, which was the institutional way of saying that his exposure to Fitch's operations required examination, which was fair, and he knew it was fair. "You're going to be cleared," she told him. "Probably," he said. "Eventually. You bought us the minutes we needed. That's on record." He looked at her with the expression he'd had since the ICU, the one she'd come to read as his version of respect, which was a complicated thing for a man who didn't give it easily. "What happens now, for you?" "I've been asked to consult on the medical protocols for the service members returning from illegal detention." She said it straightforwardly, no performance of modesty or of pride. Weld specifically requested it. There are things about what they've been through that fall outside the standard care framework. "That's a good use," Doyle said. "It's what I know how to do." He nodded. That was all. A nod, no elaboration, which was probably the most Doyle form of acknowledgement available. She took it for what it was. She walked out of the federal building into an afternoon that was cold and clear, the kind of autumn day that had no ambiguity about what season it was. The sky very blue and the air sharp in the way that reminded you that your body was a physical thing existing in a physical world with temperatures and weather and the small specific sensations of being alive in it. She stood on the steps for a moment. She thought about a storage unit with $1,400 in it and a locker with a stuck latch, and counted days, and flags that disappeared, and a woman who had made herself so small for so long that she had half believed the version of herself that everyone else saw. The thing about being dismissed, she thought, the thing nobody told you, was that it didn't stay in one place. It moved into you, took up residence. You stopped expecting to be seen, and then you stopped expecting to be heard, and eventually you stopped taking up the space that was actually yours. Because taking up space felt presumptuous, and presumption felt dangerous. And danger was the thing you'd been trained to manage, so you managed it by making yourself less. And then something happened that required you to be more, and you found out whether the years of less had taken it away. They hadn't. That was the part she hadn't been sure about, in the ICU at 5 in the morning, walking back toward a building she'd just been walked out of. She hadn't been sure there was still something there to return to. She had found out the answer the hard way, which was the only way she'd ever really learned anything, and the answer was yes. She was still there. She had been there the whole time. The 7 soldiers were home. The operation was on record. The man responsible was facing trial. The evidence she had buried 6 years ago in a transmission that she hadn't been certain would ever reach anyone had reached someone, and that had mattered, and the mattering had been worth it even through the years when she couldn't see it. She did not think the world was fair. She did not think institutions protected the people they should protect or punished the people they should punish with anything like reliable consistency. She had seen too much to think that. What she thought was this: the people who keep going anyway, who flag the thing that keeps disappearing, who go back to the building after being walked out, who whisper a call sign into a dying man's ear because he needs it, and they're the only one who can. Those people were not waiting for the world to be fair before they acted. They had decided that acting was the thing, independent of the outcome's certainty, because the alternative was to become someone who waited, and waiting had a cost that never appeared on any accounting. She walked down the steps. Somewhere across the city, Weld was in a rehabilitation facility, learning, at 38 years old, how to sleep without waking at every sound. Somewhere Merritt was in a meeting, building the next version of something the next person would need. Somewhere Crane was recovering, which he was doing badly and stubbornly, and with the absolute refusal to be either coddled or diminished, which was exactly what she would have predicted. Somewhere there was a hospital where patients had charts with flags in them, and some of those flags would disappear and some wouldn't. And the people who kept flagging them anyway were doing something that didn't require an audience to be worth doing. She had a consultation to prepare for. She had work to do. She had the name she'd been born with, which she was still getting used to wearing again, and a future that did not require her to be small inside it. That was more than she'd had yesterday. It was enough to start. She turned up her collar against the cold and walked. The woman they overlooked became the one they couldn't ignore. She didn't change. She was always exactly what she was. They just stopped being able to look away. If there's one thing this story insists on, it's this: your value was never contingent on their ability to see it. Keep doing the work. The record catches up.